In the last session, Lydia was referring to metaphors borrowed from different disciplines and thinking about the different ways that we hear them or appropriate them. And that type of sensibility is very much at the heart of what we hoped to be doing in this last panel. I had a more prepared remark, but I think what I'm going to do is just share with you a few thoughts about what I think of as perpetual oppositions in fora like this that are thinking about cross-disciplinary art practice, relationships amongst public art and cities, the relationship between aesthetics and something like social practice. One thing that I didn't hear strictly invoked as an opposition, but that often seems to shadow gatherings like this, and so I'll air it, is the so-called, the opposition between something like aesthetic rigor, aesthetic quality on the one hand, and social efficacy on the other. And there's a way that that binary, I think, is oft perpetuated, whether it's comes in places where some are concerned about the threat of so-called instrumentalization, where art basically becomes a vehicle for communicating predetermined ideas, where some also in urban planning, or from the Marxist philosophers Jane cited earlier, where something like aestheticization is a bad thing, where aestheticization is something that is actually very coincident with gentrification, with the refinement and detachment of art from and cities from the wider social world they inhabit. It's also in that kind of opposition that students will refer to the trashy aesthetic that Andrea brought up. Why does this art have to look so bad? And conversely, accusations around elitism, that you know, do I have to know this art history in order to understand this work, that the detachment from the social is an elitist position. So it often seems to me that not only are those made, constructed oppositions, but also that different receivers will have different sensibilities in deciding where the line is drawn between them. We can have some critic call Theaster a compromising pragmatist, and to another urban planner, he doesn't look useful at all. So I think that often those types of accusations about what looks formally rigorous, what looks too arty, what doesn't look arty enough, are really actually quite variable. So I put that out, I think, in part for thinking about what cross-disciplinary work is. I'm currently co-teaching at Berkeley, as part of a larger Mellon project, a course with a professor in city and regional planning. I've been working a lot in this domain. I think I understand some elements of how, quote, they talk, and yet it still is so striking to me what becomes sort of standard and normalized language that she hears in me and that I hear in her as we're working. And I feel like that happened a few times today. A couple things that I opened earlier, for those of you who were here at the beginning, I often think that it still is useful to think about the ways that these kinds of practices, whether it's Theaster's work or others, confound certain kinds of aesthetic categories or ways of talking about art practice. And I think when I teach this or think about this, I often remind myself of these kinds of polarizations. The polarization between form and content, between background and foreground, product, process, inside, outside, medium, support, autonomy, heteronomy, text, context, form, function, etc. And that so many of these things are inside-outside metaphors that shore up as a notion of where the art begins and the rest of the world, where the art ends and the rest of the world begins. And what I think is so interesting formally about Theaster's work and work that moves me is places that not only refuse that boundary, but also provoke me to think about where I draw these lines. So it often it seems to me that there's so much about Theaster's work that foregrounds the conditions of its production as interior to the art event, not as an extraneous thing on the side, but as something that you bring into the art art project itself. I was struck when Katayun, in one of her cell pieces, cell reflections, she talked about how cells produce and replicate structures that simultaneously sustain them. And I think about that in terms of art practice itself, that the art object isn't necessarily separable from the pedestal that holds it, which itself isn't separable from the wood that supports the pedestal, which isn't separable from the workers who have furnished the wood, who built the house in which the art is housed. And the ways in which the world, once imagined on these ever widening scales, basically confounds any type of opposition you would have between the insidedness of art and the outsidedness of art. And to me, that's a huge part, when we see these kinds of slides, that's a huge reminder to me of the embeddedness and intense enmeshment of even artwork that might think of itself as autonomous and unfettered from structures of labor or from a staff that builds it. I'll also cut and not say too much more, but a problem that I've been thinking about a lot and thought about it a lot throughout the day is the ways in which oppositions between a kind of antagonistic criticality in socially engaged art practice butts up against the do-gooding ethos, the community-building ethos, and the one that would seek consensus. And I think that there's a way that opposition itself is both productive and also sometimes at risk of being routinized. That there might be certain ways that the call for a certain kind of antagonism, of a perpetual problematization, a perpetual criticality, can also be self-protective, can also be, as Mark said earlier, a kind of odd social privilege, however much it understands itself to be attached to a radical left democratic project. That's sort of like, I can figure out the way to pull the rug out from under this at every move, becomes its own, I think, both necessary act, but can also become a self-protective act. And I'm interested in how that kind of criticality enters Theaster's work, and at the same time, how a certain kind of antagonistic potential comes not only in the thing that we hear as criticality, but also in the moment of hospitality or in the moment of sincerity at a time when you least expected it, and how much that might jostle and have as much antagonistic potential as any more edgier art we might think. And finally, I'll just, in addition to some of these arty terms that are often used in vocabularies for thinking about this work, I thought all throughout the day, that a variety of wicked problems ensue when they're joined to arenas in urban planning or in creative placemaking, where terms like community are bandied about, and the question then becomes how, if community has become this mantra that is used in part as a kind of tool in terms of advancement and of capital accumulation, how does one work in a world where that discourse is on the umbrella, is under the umbrella, and it comes out of the mouths of every mayor, every urban planner, and how does one work with that and redirect it? I thought it striking that the word neighbor comes up. I think the word neighbor is different from the word friend. I think that it implies not only the act of being neighborly as something voluntary, but as also a kind of, neighbors are infrastructurally connected in ways that are unbidden and not always chosen. And the ways in which we respond to those moments is really where the sort of deeper ethics might be that becomes, something that you don't always get to choose, and but it really is at the heart of what it means to inhabit a social sphere together. Finally, I think that there are some really hard questions that have been asked throughout the day about Theaster's work that really are questions for what social engagement in art and cultural sectors can be when, for instance, money is involved. I think that there's interesting ways that Theaster's project mixes money, redirects different kinds of money, challenges distinctions between for-profit, not-for-profit, and public sector, those categories and divisions. It's interesting to be in the midst of someone who, it seems to me, often thinks of money as a kind of material. It's not the backgrounded thing that we don't talk about, but the cash is part of the thing that's circulated in the artwork. His fame is something, Theaster's fame is something that is circulated in the artwork and potentially redirected for other means. Corporate interest in weirdos is something that is, what does it mean to make that part of the material of the art event? And I think in all of these situations, you're at risk of, where one might want to deploy a thing like this, elements like this that are usually backgrounded, there's always that risk that it will deploy you. And I think it's there. I think that this is not a pure process. I think that there are not neat good guys and neat bad guys here. And I don't think any of us is pure. And I think that the acknowledgement of the enmeshment rather than detachment from these asymmetrical economies is really a step that all need to make in order to figure out ways to inhabit an asymmetrical social sphere that we share. So I'll stop there.
So I'm going to take up a little bit from where Shannon left off around the idea of the neighbor, and I'm going to actually read a little bit from a prepared remarks, because in the interest of time and not waffling on by riffing. What does it mean to live next to Theaster Gates? He moves in next door to you on Dorchester Avenue in Chicago, then across the street, and he acquires another place further down. During this lateral expansion, the houses are gutted, reused, and rebuilt. They turn into archives, cinema houses, libraries, and arts incubators. Sometimes the doors are open and you might be invited in. There's dinner, music, folks from elsewhere stop by. What's happening on the block? Gates is quick to say that what he does and what he's done has nothing to do with having a mission. It's about staying and building the place in which you want to be. It takes time and trust so that it's a kind of honor on both sides to invite and be invited in. With such a model, he sets his work apart from other projects with a social orientation where the term community is one to ooze through like a deli schmear, seemingly generous and ultimately fattening. Community often refers to an amorphous group of people out there with whom the artist engages, and it can be equally be an identitarian construct that circumscribes the boundaries of who is in and who is out. Theaster doesn't use the vocabulary of community or outreach. He isn't out to do good for anyone or insist on forms of obligatory friendliness and reciprocity. He actually lives there. But his sort of living isn't like any other. And here, there, somewhere goes the neighborhood. The idea of a neighborhood that's going somewhere with its attendant spectrum of race, gentrification, homogeneity has a genealogy deeply rooted in the histories of race and class divisions in the United States, and it's right in the middle of that history that Theaster plonks himself with unusual and energetic enterprise. The sort of neighborliness he proffers is a potent mix of planning, developing, and building that I suspect feels like living next door to Live Yeast, continually growing, rising, expanding. Yes, he's got the artisan's hand to shape it as it grows and to set it on the table so that bread might be broken together. Where a real estate developer might see dilapidated houses as abandonment, as an absence waiting to be filled, Theaster seems to see in the same boarded-up houses the bones of a presence waiting to fill out. He wonders, in fact, in an article in Chicago Weekly, what it might mean for neighbors to be developers. What indeed could that mean? Gates is interested in adjacencies, the act of placing alongside, of placing atop, of placing within. The boards of an old bowling alley become the floors of 6918 South Dorchester, and the dismantled timbers and materials of 6901 travel across the Atlantic, where they're reassembled to repair the Huguenot house in Kassel, Germany. This is restoration as in restore, storing anew, Meaning adheres to these materials. They're not being repurposed to signify something new, but reworked and repositioned to reveal their own embedded meanings, acquire a new sheen, and in so doing, blow another wind into the air around them. The Dorchester projects house entire collections that were in danger of being tossed out but were waylaid by Gates, who sees in them forms of what he calls discarded knowledge. A glass-side collection from the University of Chicago Art History Department, fallen victim to newer technology, vinyl LPs from a failing record store, collections of Jet and Ebony magazines, all find a home here in toto. As unexpected neighbors, they generate their own context and meanings. As a curator myself who works in a public realm and as the curator of the university galleries, I have been thinking about the politics and responsibilities of place and placement, particularly with regard to the role of the university in the city. Many universities are the largest landholders in their area, major landlords and major tenants, and their academic calendar cycles have a strong impact on local economies. Their expansion plans and various forms of infrastructural investment affect their surroundings, often rousing spirited local responses from residents and businesses in the neighborhood. These days, universities are rarely content to be local, most having satellite programs, campuses, and partnerships in other locations in the world. Driven in good measure by economic considerations, these distributed network models only make manifest the complicated politics of place. Models of neighborliness at universities, including ours, have taken such forms as community development and public and civic engagement. Can neighborliness really be radical, inclusive, open to change, not prescriptive, resulting in forms of reciprocal but non-demanding investment? What would it mean for a university to explore this as a model of engagement? As in educational institutions, can its public spaces offer particular opportunities to test, experiment, debate, think, and transform together? Gates himself is square in the middle of these questions. As the director of the Arts and Public Life Initiative at the University of Chicago, in whose hinterland of the South Side the Dorchester projects find their home, he is now spearheading a new arts incubator in a converted bank, which offers artist residencies, workshops, and a gallery. So he is involved in making the university his neighbor. As the individual and the institutional cross-pollinate in his work, can we think of Gates as the curator of a kind of neighborliness, if a curator is thought of as someone who takes care, not in order to preserve for display, not in order to conserve either, but rather to attend to things and to what surrounds those things, to shine them special because they're there next door to where we live. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we're going to change the order just slightly insofar as I, unfortunately, am going to have to leave shortly, very much sort of in keeping with the spirit of today's event and all of the complicated questions that it raises. I have to give a presentation to a board meeting. Mm-hmm. So my name is Laura Arricchio.
We'll just let that sit.
Moment of silence. My name is Laura Arricchio, and I have had the great pleasure and privilege of actually sharing in one of Theaster's performances. He invited me to participate in a performance in New York a few years ago now, in a townhouse. It was I performed as an art historian, which is actually what I am, so it wasn't that difficult an acting gig. But at the moment, I'm here more in my guise as the Dean of the School of Undergraduate Studies at a division of the university whose very name has raised many, many issues for me and for a lot of us, the New School for Public Engagement. And we've all been grappling with this for several years now. What does it mean to claim to be a school for public engagement? And what does it mean to be someone working in the arts or cultures who's claiming to be doing so in the name of public engagement? Who's the public? What does the engagement look like? And I actually, inspired this morning by the spontaneous call and response singing, I ran back to my office and grabbed a poem. And this is a poem that, but I'm going to conclude with it, but I just want to explain a little bit where it comes from because it's kind of interesting. We have been grappling at this university a good deal with the question of what does it mean to create equitable partnerships with external organizations, whatever those may be. What does it look like to create partnerships that are not us going out and being community do-gooders? Was that the quote? Community good-doers? Do-gooders. Or good doers, either one. It doesn't sound good, no matter how you put it. So the question was, how do we create equitable partnerships? And as one way to approach this, my division reached out to the New York Council for the Humanities, which is already doing community-based work, usually involving literature, creating quote-unquote community conversations around works of literature that are meant to get at questions of things like what is service? What is citizenship? Things like this. So there's many, many layers involved with this partnership. But one of the questions that we asked ourselves was, well, how do we, as a university and as a foundation, come together? What is our relationship to each other? And we decided that we would actually begin by inviting some folks from Chicago who had put together something called the Civically Engaged Reader. And we read parts of this together, and we sat and had a conversation. And so this is all of the background that I'm going to give you. And what I'm actually intending to do by reading the poem is merely to provoke, to raise some of the oppositions that Shannon began with, and to simply put these ideas and questions out there. I have no answer. So this is purely meant as a sort of prompt for thinking. So it's a brief poem, it's 4 stanzas, it won't take too long. It's by Bertolt Brecht, and it's called A Bed for the Night. And it takes place here. I hear that in New York, at the corner of 26th Street and Broadway, a man stands every evening during the winter months and gets beds for the homeless there by appealing to passersby. It won't change the world. It won't improve relations among men. It will not shorten the age of exploitation. But a few men have a bed for the night. For a night the wind is kept from them. The snow meant for them falls on the roadway. Don't put down the book on reading this, man. A few people have a bed for the night. For a night the wind is kept from them. The snow meant for them falls on the roadway. But it won't change the world. It won't improve relations among men. It will not shorten the age of exploitation. Thank you.
Okay, I have the pleasure of being the last one, so I'm going to keep it brief and in the interest of really having a conversation and hearing from everybody here, hoping to put some questions out there for us to think about. I have not visited the Dorchester projects. And so for me, thinking about the Dorchester projects and talking about it would be as if I was trying to talk to you about a film by looking at only one still image. Because the Dorchester projects for me is something that needs to be experienced. I see it as time-based work. It's evolved, it continues to evolve, it hosts, it has events. And so what I've been most inspired by when I first met Theaster in the spring is him and his choices and his intentionality of not being up here today and speaking, but listening and participating. The intentionality behind his choice of words, so not using community, but using the word development, making us wonder, is it about real estate development, is it community development, and really giving us the freedom to approach it from any hat that we may be wearing. And if we look at the questions for this panel, there's a question about authorship, but I would be more interested in his work in talking about audience or audiences. And so who are the audiences of his work when he is constituting a nonprofit and speaking with lawyers, and who is the audience of the food gatherings that he hosts, or the performances that he gives, or these panels that he may attend. He, in his most recent participation this afternoon, brought up the word complicating, and I think that by withholding and giving us these few words, he is helping us complicate many of these issues, and for that I'm appreciative. I also wanted to speak a little bit to this a way of working, which I have a hard time with myself because I am an artist who teaches design, and most recently I'm a university administrator. And I haven't yet been able to integrate those three things, and I quite like keeping them separate because I can move freely between them and feel like I can multitask or take breaks from one or the other. But I really love how Theaster is able to, it seems to me, be able to move much more seamlessly between them. And I'm really inspired by, for example, his taking on socially engaged work not as an NGO or as a design project, but as an art practice. And I wonder if the socially engaged work that I've done with colleagues who are here would be freer in terms of how we approach it, but also in terms of the accountability and the evaluations with which we have to approach it if we framed it as an art practice and not as community engagement or development that then has to bring along monitoring and evaluation and all of these things. Most recently, as a university administrator, I've been leading out the academic side of our new global initiatives. So I've been leading out how the New School is thinking about these global hubs, and in the strategic document that I have in front of me are referred to as portals, which is a very interesting word. And this summer I had the opportunity to go to Mumbai, where we're helping start a design school called the Indian School for Design and Innovation, Parsons, Mumbai. And when you stand in the space that they will occupy starting next year, you can see that they and we with them have a magnificent opportunity if we really think about the neighborliness aspect of the potential of global work and social engagement for a university. So when you're standing in this space, which is part of a brand new corporate building in the city of Mumbai, if you look out one window, you see only construction crews, cranes, high-rises going up, being quickly occupied by corporations and banks and multinational firms. And if you look out the other side of the same floor, so it's the entire building, if you look outside, you see railroad tracks and low-income housing. And so literally the university there, the school there, has this opportunity to choose what side they want to look towards. And because we are a tuition-driven institution, we'll tend to look towards one side where we can hopefully fund the university. And I wonder if we could, as a university, sustainably also engage with the other side. And how can we bridge those two? And I think that Theaster's practice is a really interesting model for us to think about that bridging. So I just wanted to read to you the text that I've chosen here as a paragraph. It's actually the New School's vision statement because it has many of the terms that have come up today, and I think it presents an interesting challenge and perhaps framing for a conversation. So it reads as follows. We are and will be a university where design and social research drive approaches to studying issues of our time, such as democracy, urbanization, technological change, economic empowerment, sustainability, migration, and globalization. We will be the preeminent intellectual and creative center for effective engagement in a world that increasingly demands better designed objects, communication, systems, and organizations to meet social needs. Already very apparent to me as I was reading this this afternoon is the absence of the word people. People that can meet social needs and not just all these other things that we're designing. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.
People have questions. I know that Laura has to leave, so I wanted to ask you one quickly before you. So I guess it's two quick ones. One is whether or not in your discussions around creation of equitable partnerships, I wonder about whether there's ever been any discussion about some of say the kinds of thinking that Jasmine was invoking earlier, where democracy isn't something that is achieved or an equity that is achieved, but something that is in a sort of constant state of dissensus, and where it might be about creating a structure that allows for that dynamism rather than hoping. So that.
Yeah, no, that's precisely correct, and I think it's actually really crucial because it seems to me that one of the initiatives that the university has recently actually created is something called a Collaboratory, and this Collaboratory is meant to be, I believe, a 2-year project. Is anyone here involved with it? You are. A 2-year project? You are. Is that correct? And this 2-year project, what it's actually done is it's taken funding from the Rockefeller Foundation. Is that correct? Yep. And used it to sort of seed faculty work that is engaged in whatever way that means for each project, but then brings those faculty members and groups and projects together over the course of 2 years with sort of the knowledge that they'll be learning from, developing upon, and constantly sort of changing and refining as it goes. And so I think that the idea is, in fact, to build in a support structure to have that constant, I don't want to use the word development, I'm not sure what the word is, constant morphing, perhaps, might be the best way to put it, throughout. And then the idea is that once, obviously this is, what's the word? Interaction. And so this is what's sort of at the root of it. So yes, I mean, we are, yes. You said you had 2 questions.
I did, but I know others have others.
Oh, sorry.
So I'll track you down some other time.
A crucial part of that is also engaging with the nonprofit partner in the community, and whatever that means. And all of us who are working on those collaboratories are trying to figure out how to do that well, because there isn't a very good model for the university to do that, and I think we're trying to develop that. So
yeah,
it's part of the
exactly.
challenge.
And that's exactly why I know that as an art historian, I realize that I feel slightly awkward that I did not actually tackle the formal or historical dimensions of Theaster's work. But I actually think that for us here at the university right now, the work that Theaster does as a nonprofit and in concert with nonprofits is actually perhaps to my mind, one of the most generative and one of the most compelling and one of the most provocative that really gives us, I think, a lot of food for thought in my mind. So yes, agreed. It's a work in progress for sure.
Yeah, okay. Two things, they're not really questions. The first is I keep hearing the word, I've heard over the day transdisciplinary, and just about 6 months ago I was in this room for the launch of Blink Your Eyes, the Sekou Sundiata project. Was anybody else here? Does anybody else know what I'm talking about? So it's actually pretty related to this, and I just, I think it's still going on, so I would encourage people to engage with that, and since it's also, I think, related to the Buralist Center in some way, I think it could be really interesting to create some kind of dialogue between Sekou, who developed a pedagogy around this practice, 20 years ago, and see how that interrelates with this practice, because I think there's a lot of value there, and I think that since he worked in the spoken word and the musical idioms, and I'm sort of a big fan of performative and embodied practices, I think that this is actually an opportunity to look into. Speaking of embodied practice and referencing what Shannon was saying and referencing what Provost Lawson was saying about the absence of people in the language. What, Cynthia? I just thought it was really interesting. I hope I can get to Chicago to experience it. But the thing that sort of keeps popping up to me all day is sort of this opposition, this constant state of why are we confronting these oppositions? I just want to sort of point out the performativity of this space. The sort of design of this social sculpture that we're having right now is oppositional. Where we sort of have a hierarchy of power and authority over there and us out here. And from a design perspective, from a social design perspective, I guess, and from an aesthetic perspective, I would say that from what I understand of the work, it's actually counter to that, right? And so it's just interesting, not that far from here was Judson Church, and 50 years ago, the Judson Dance Theater shifted the frame of experience of dance from presentational to 360 degrees. And I feel like there's a piece here about embodied practice, and I think there's about sort of like almost a necessity for a phenomenological shift in the way we approach this kind of work and the way we talk about this work, because it's like we're still in the subject-object relation to the work. But until we sort of enter into a subject-subject relation to the work and with each other, we're going to keep facing these dualities and these oppositions that are largely created, and we're not going to be able to move forward into a more meaningful discourse. So I don't know, I just wanted to sort of float that, because there's so many I wish we could hang out and just talk to everyone. It's kind of amazing. Thanks.
I just want to really briefly say something about how I guess I feel like you bringing up Sekou is, to me, just an opportunity to say that even if there's gatherings like this that are around socially engaged art, I often end up in my little life feeling that different fora are measuring their distance from certain art forms, and that for people who come from performance and theater, the art market gallery system is not, or hasn't often been the market or the way of thinking about the economy. And so if you're thinking about deploying alternate cultural economies, it's also, I think, important to notice that different art forms also have different structures and systems too. And that part of what I feel like you've also brought up is just really that there's a wider group, and probably here in the room, a wider group of art practitioners that measure their distance from, not from, say, sculpture or ceramics, but from other forms, and that we need to be all together, thinking together.
Just to build on what you're saying, and maybe just to be clearer. Maybe just to say it again. No, or just to say it again, that there are scales, and it is an interesting question when you're talking about creating an environment that runs from pots to buildings, that there's an entire kind of world of scales and relationships that are actually being struck between the producer, the maker, and the product, be it performance or or architecture or real estate.
Right.
So.
Yeah. Yeah.
When you started off the talk, you were talking about the polarization of ideas, and again, in my work here and at the New School in Parsons, there was a lot of discussion about binaries and kind of challenging these binary normativities, and I'm wondering how to say this. I feel like we're constantly challenging that, but I'm wondering what the value is of trying to find that interstitial space between polarizations, between binaries, and how that plays out in professional practice. Am I making any? I may not be making sense.
Well, I mean, I think in Theaster you should answer too. To me, it's not just the interstitial space between. It's really that there isn't necessarily the between space that allows you to think that one is separable from the other. So to me, what I think that a huge part of the effect is that we become cognizant of our co-creation and of the and enmeshment in a wider set of systems that certain kinds of art practices repress and that others foreground. And I think that you can have lots of different art practices. Not everybody has to do this, but those who do, I think, are helping create a bridge between art making, studio practice, and all the other stuff that needs to be addressed incorporated, that needs to be creatively rethought. Okay, Theaster, do you want to say something? Yeah.
So this is good. And in some ways, I feel like
What I was gonna say. Oh, one thing. Everybody is always saying that they're challenging things, right? Challenging these binaries. The other thing I was going to say is I also feel that minimalism thought it was challenging it, right? And that at a certain point, some of these practices start to call the bluff of that challenge. And I guess that's what I feel like is happening here. Go ahead. Sorry.
I don't know if I can do justice, but I do feel like if we were to try to I want to create an artificial binary. Like, I have some friends who feel like they will only make, like, I was part of a talk where a young man who makes paintings said, when asked, don't you want black people to own these things? You know, don't you want black people to be able to buy one of your paintings? And don't you think your price point prices them out of the market? And he was like, I'm not making paintings for poor black people. I'm making paintings so that they can live in art history. And I'm making them with a certain kind of understanding that they're gonna live in the market in a certain way. Like, my paintings cost $1 million, that's what they cost. Kids can see them in an art history book one day. But you ain't gotta own my painting for the painting to have impact in a black neighborhood. Let's say that's one side. The other side is the person who says, there's no way I can be in cahoots with the market at all. That I'd rather suffer through the pain and the figuring out rather than to give myself over to these market forces that I just don't believe in. You know, that there's no way that I can make these discrete objects and feel like I'm doing my soul good, right? And so there's this other side. And then I feel like, you know, it's like after a while you get to a point in your practice where you just want to say the things you want to say. Like it actually, like capital and the market doesn't have to be the principal thing that causes you to think you're on one side or another. It's like, oh, I want to be in conversation with planners about housing policy and building codes because I think building codes are like 100 years outdated. And the way that we use buildings in cities today is different from the way we used to use buildings. I'm not gonna make a painting about building codes. You know what I'm saying? Like, so I have to respond to planning with a plannerly attempt. And so that becomes one strand, one trajectory, because I want to talk to that thing. If people don't know what to do with buildings in Detroit, and they think that the only option is to tear them all down and become agrarian again, I want to speak to that. You know, and I don't want to speak to that like I used to speak to that by making clay objects about the buildings that were torn down, right? Like it was the only method in my studio. It was the only tactic that I had as a potter to talk about the problems of gentrification was to build a clay house about it. That's where I was until I wanted to figure out another impactfulness, affect. I wanted to actually engage the matter of gentrification. And so then there was another trajectory. Then it was like, I see the black middle class all the time, and they say, Theaster, you should move out of your neighborhood and you should live in Kenwood or Hyde Park or in Winnetka with all the rest of the Jews. You should stop your black, you've ascended into Jewishness. You should like, it's like they left, and then then now we can live in Winnetka. And there's this chasing, this kind of post-colonial, this problem that colonized people have. Weirdo Negroes chasing. And it's like, why in the hell would you want to live up? They don't want you up there. Those synagogues ain't gonna ever pray like your preacher pray on Sunday. So you can't, and so I think that all of these things, whether it's the engagement, that one doesn't have to choose. And I think sometimes the polarization is with the same mixed up confusion that we have around orthodoxy. It's a way that we've been taught in the West that you have to love the one and hate the other. You have to be hot or cold, or I'll spew you out of my mouth. There's all these things that make you think that lukewarm feels good to me. You know what I mean? That maybe there's something in between that starts to get the more temperate, mildewy, moldy stuff that accumulates and gets on everything and makes stuff real nasty.
I think you're pointing to the cultural just then actually kind of underscores a question that I have, or it's just something that I'd like to raise. One of the things that I've been aware of in our discussions today is the degree to which we have evaded being clear, being articulate about the cultural aspects of this, the blackness, the specifics of it, the ways in which you have engaged that in terms of content. Where is that content in your work? It's interesting to me that even in this room, the questions that are being asked in terms of sort of culture and the identitarianism only really got pushed through a queer lens, which is an interesting thing in terms of the going discourses and what still gets talked about. I'm wondering what happens when in fact you're doing a project like this and the tendency in the criticism and in the critical language is to evade the culture out of which you come.
I really want to hear from these I mean, in some ways, like the race piece and then the culture piece. The way that plays out sometimes, Tony, is that people will, like in Chicago, where I live, like when I go to a evening gala, and I show up, and folk are like, "Oh, Theaster, are you okay? You know, we know you've been traveling and things are growing, and you know, there's like this kind of anxiety that I'm about to topple, like I call it the Basquiat effect, you know, or like Bessie Smith. They think any Negro that does well at some point is gonna get turned out on heroin. You know, there's like this like worry, like, or all these lawyers who are always saying, well, in the event that you get hit by a truck, you need to do, and it's like, why would you ever wish such evil things on me? Can't this be one of those great moments where like somebody's normal and like non-addictive and like get a little extra cash and do a little good? White people do it all the time. But there is this particular kind of nervousness that I feel around me, where people aren't necessarily always calling out a race card or a you know, the work has loaded in it lots of things, God, race, money, whatever. But there is a kind of anxious, nervous hostility that actually does more harm than good. So that it becomes self-prophetic. Like they'll be like, there's no way that Theaster can sustain this amount of cultural production. Like at some point it's just gonna fall on itself. It's like, and then it's like, well, when the if MacArthur and the Joyce Foundation and Rockefeller are all saying that at some point this Negro can't sustain this thing, then they're gonna be like, well, we can't support this. You know, it's like, how is this gonna, who does he think he is? You know, it's like, well, you know, and so there are just these moments where I think these old ideas of kind of a national self-sufficiency or a call to, now I'm employing certain standards of sustainability. Like I may have to endow something. You know, I may have to ask somebody else to help me. Something might have to get named. The Karen Kuoni Center of Chicago South Side Radical Spatial Politics.
She'll write the check.
But I think that there's been some real value in both, and I'll say this as a way of going home, degenderizing and deracializing as a deployment a kind of choice to androgynize, depoliticize. Of course this is about community, but that's the wrong word. Of course this is about race. It's the wrong word. And at any point, any of those little buckets that we create for ourselves, I'm a this, I'm a that, I'm a that, people start to hold you to it. And it becomes limiting in a way so that if your stuff is about gender, why don't you just do the gender stuff? You ain't ever got to say it. Because as soon as you do it, then you'll only be invited to participate in gender-based museum opportunities. This, you know, is it about race? Hell yeah, it's about race. It's always about race. It's always about Jesus. I ain't gonna never tell you that. Okay, thank you.